In the summer of 18, a fire that consumed the Whispering Pines Orphanage in rural Vermont revealed horrors that had been hidden for 18 years behind the facade of Christian charity. When firefighters searched the smoldering ruins, they discovered evidence of systematic torture, medical experimentation, and child abuse so severe that the official investigation was immediately classified to prevent public panic. Hidden basement chambers filled with restraint devices, medical instruments stained with blood, and detailed journals documenting behavioral correction procedures painted a picture of an institution where children weren't being saved, they were being systematically broken. The Burlington County Coroner's report, sealed for over a century, described physical evidence on the bodies recovered from the fire that suggested years of deliberate physical and psychological trauma inflicted under the guise of moral education. What the state authorities buried in classified files, what local officials agreed never to discuss publicly, and what the surviving children were forbidden to speak about under threat of imprisonment, reveals the darkest chapter in Vermont's history of child welfare. Before we continue with the story of Whispering Pines and the children who endured unimaginable suffering behind its charitable facade, if you're listening to this story, you're about to hear details that have never been shared publicly before, recovered from recently declassified documents and survivor testimonies that were hidden for over 130 years. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest historical secrets. And please tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our community of truth seekers is located around the world. The trail that led us to this story began not in Vermont, but in the basement archives of the Boston Medical Historical Society, where a routine cataloging project uncovered a leather-bound journal that would expose the systematic horrors inflicted on vulnerable children in the name of Christian discipline and scientific progress. Established in 1871 on the outskirts of Millbrook, Vermont, the Whispering Pines Orphanage stood as what appeared to be a beacon of Christian charity in a region still recovering from the devastating losses of the Civil War. The imposing three-story brick building, constructed with donations from the Burlington Railroad Company and local timber barons, housed up to 50 children at a time, war orphans, foundlings, and the unwanted offspring of families destroyed by poverty, disease, or shame. Dr. Ezekiel Harrington, a former Union Army surgeon turned self-proclaimed child psychologist, founded the institution with his wife Margaret after developing what he called revolutionary theories about child development and moral education. Unlike other orphanages of the era that focused primarily on basic care and religious instruction, Whispering Pines advertised itself as a correctional institution for the moral and physical improvement of defective youth. It was a place where children with behavioral problems, learning difficulties, or hereditary criminal tendencies could be transformed into productive citizens through rigorous scientific intervention. The surrounding community of Millbrook, population 847 according to the 1880 census, initially welcomed the orphanage with enthusiasm. Local newspapers praised Dr. Harrington's innovative approach to child welfare, and prominent families donated generously to support what they believed was cutting-edge work in child psychology. The Burlington Free Press published glowing articles about Dr. Harrington's methods, describing him as a pioneer in the scientific treatment of juvenile delinquency and moral deficiency. However, beneath this veneer of progressive child care lay a more sinister reality. Children admitted to Whispering Pines were classified into categories based on Dr. Harrington's assessment of their reformation potential. Those deemed mildly defective were subjected to standard orphanage routines of work, study, and religious instruction, but children classified as severely compromised or potentially criminal were enrolled in what Dr. Harrington called his special treatment program, a regime of physical punishment, psychological manipulation, and medical experimentation that would have been recognized as torture by any reasonable observer. The orphanage's isolation proved crucial to Dr. Harrington's ability to conduct his experiments without oversight. Located 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and accessible only by a single dirt road that became impossible during Vermont's brutal winters, Whispering Pines operated as a closed world where Dr. Harrington's authority was absolute. State inspection visits, required annually by Vermont law, were carefully orchestrated events where only the mildly defective children were visible to officials, while those undergoing special treatment were confined to basement areas that inspectors never saw. Among the children who endured Dr. Harrington's special treatment during the institution's 18th-year existence were Thomas Kellerman, admitted at age 8 for chronic disobedience and theft tendencies after his father's death in a mill accident; Sarah and Rebecca Dunham, twin sisters classified as morally deficient after being found begging on the streets of Montpelier; young Marcus Trenton, labeled mentally defective after displaying symptoms that would later be recognized as trauma response from witnessing his family's death from tuberculosis; and dozens of other children whose only crime was having nowhere else to go. The daily routine at Whispering Pines varied dramatically depending on a child's classification. For the fortunate few deemed reformable, life consisted of the harsh but relatively standard orphanage experience: early morning prayers at 500 a.m., basic education focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic, manual labor in the institution's workshops and gardens, and evening religious instruction before bed at 800 p.m. These children slept in dormitories on the second floor, ate meals in the main dining hall, and occasionally received visits from potential adoptive families who toured the facility. But for children in the special treatment program, existence at Whispering Pines was a carefully designed nightmare. These children were housed in basement cells that Dr. Harrington euphemistically called reflection chambers, windowless rooms barely large enough for a straw mattress, equipped with heavy wooden doors that could be locked from the outside and small slots through which food could be passed. The basement areas were deliberately kept cold and damp, with stone walls that wept moisture and floors that remained perpetually wet, creating conditions that Dr. Harrington believed would humble the spirit and prepare the mind for moral instruction. The true nature of Dr. Harrington's special treatment program became clear through the recovery of his detailed experimental logs, found in a fireproof safe buried beneath the orphanage's foundation after the 1889 fire. These documents, written in Dr. Harrington's precise medical handwriting, described 18 years of systematic abuse disguised as scientific research into criminal psychology and behavioral modification. Harrington's experiments began with what he called baseline assessments, extended periods of isolation designed to break down a child's psychological defenses and establish his absolute authority over their existence. Children selected for special treatment were taken from their dormitories without explanation, usually in the middle of the night, and confined to the basement reflection chambers for periods ranging from 1 week to 3 months, depending on what Dr. Harrington perceived as their level of resistance to moral instruction. During these isolation periods, children received minimal food, typically bread and water once daily, with occasional additions of thin gruel, if Dr. Harrington determined they were showing appropriate remorse for their defects. The reflection chambers were kept in complete darkness, except for brief periods when Dr. Harrington visited to conduct what he called moral examinations, sessions where children were required to confess their inherent wickedness and beg for the opportunity to be reformed. Thomas Kellerman's case, documented in excruciating detail in Dr. Harrington's logs, illustrates the progression of the special treatment program. Admitted to Whispering Pines in 1875 at age 8, Thomas was initially classified as mildly defective due to his tendency to steal food from the kitchen. However, when he was caught sharing bread with younger children, Dr. Harrington reclassified him as potentially criminal and transferred him to the special treatment program. Thomas's first isolation period lasted 6 weeks. Dr. Harrington's notes described the boy's psychological deterioration in clinical terms. Subject initially displayed defiance and demands for release. By day 12, subject had ceased vocal protests, but maintained resistant posture during examinations. Day 18 showed first signs of submission. Subject began responding to questions with appropriate deference. By day 35, subject demonstrated complete acceptance of his defective nature and genuine gratitude for the opportunity to undergo reformation. But isolation was only the beginning of Dr. Harrington's treatment program. Once a child's psychological resistance had been broken through prolonged confinement, they were subjected to what he called corrective conditioning, a series of physical and psychological punishments designed to eliminate specific behaviors that Dr. Harrington considered morally deficient. Children who had been caught lying were subjected to truth conditioning, extended sessions where they were required to confess to crimes they had not committed while being subjected to painful stimuli until they could recite their false confessions with convincing emotion. Those who showed excessive emotional expression underwent emotional regulation therapy, periods of physical restraint combined with exposure to disturbing images and sounds designed to desensitize them to human suffering. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Harrington's program was his use of what he called pain conditioning to eliminate behaviors he considered undesirable. Children caught showing affection toward each other were subjected to electric shocks administered through a device Dr. Harrington had constructed from parts ordered through medical supply companies. Those who displayed curiosity or asked questions were punished with ice baths that lowered their body temperature to dangerous levels. Children who cried or showed fear were restrained and exposed to their greatest phobias until they learned to suppress all emotional responses. Sarah and Rebecca Dunham, the twin sisters admitted in 1878, became particular subjects of Dr. Harrington's attention because their bond with each other represented what he saw as unhealthy emotional dependency. His treatment logs describe a systematic campaign to destroy their relationship through a technique he called loyalty transient conditioning. The twins were placed in recreation of which shamed, or each could hear the other being subjected to punishment, but were told that the suffering would stop only when they demonstrated complete indifference to each other's pain. The conditioning process for the Dunham twins lasted 8 months. Dr. Harrington's notes record his satisfaction as the girls gradually stopped responding to each other's cries, learned to report each other's minor infractions to gain small privileges, and eventually reached a state where they could watch each other being punished without showing any emotional response. Subjects have successfully transferred their loyalty from each other to the institution. Dr. Harrington wrote, "They now understand that emotional attachments are obstacles to moral development and have achieved the detachment necessary for proper social functioning." The systematic torture that Dr. Harrington disguised as moral education continued for 18 years, affecting hundreds of children whose only crime was being orphaned, abandoned, or born into poverty. If these revelations about America's hidden history of institutional abuse are opening your eyes to truths that were deliberately concealed, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. We're uncovering evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about 19th century child welfare, and your engagement helps us continue this important work. But the full scope of Dr. Harrington's experimental program would only become clear when investigators discovered the medical wing of his operation, a series of basement laboratories where he conducted physical experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and medical ethics. Beyond the psychological torture disguised as moral education, Dr. Harrington had established what he called the Medical Research Division of his special treatment program. This division, housed in a separate section of the basement that he had constructed in 1876, represented his attempt to apply the principles of scientific experimentation to what he believed was the biological basis of criminal behavior and moral deficiency. Dr. Harrington's medical experiments were based on his belief that criminal tendencies and moral failings were caused by physical abnormalities that could be corrected through surgical and pharmaceutical intervention. His research notes recovered from the basement laboratory describe a progression of increasingly invasive procedures conducted on children who had been deemed medically experimental candidates, typically those who had failed to respond to his psychological conditioning methods. The medical wing contained 3 treatment rooms equipped with surgical tables, restraint devices, and cabinets filled with primitive medical instruments that Dr. Harrington had designed himself or modified from standard surgical tools. The walls were lined with glass jars containing organs, tissue samples, and other biological specimens that Dr. Harrington had removed from children during his experiments, each labeled with clinical notations about the subject's age, behavioral classification, and the hypothesis being tested. Marcus Trenton, the young boy who had been classified as mentally defective after witnessing his family's death, became one of Dr. Harrington's primary medical research subjects. Harrington's experimental logs describe a series of procedures conducted on Marcus over a 3-year period, beginning when the boy was 9 years old. These procedures were based on Dr. Harrington's theory that mental deficiency was caused by excessive brain fluid that could be drained through small holes drilled in the skull. The surgical logs describe the primitive brain surgery that Dr. Harrington performed on Marcus without anesthesia, believing that the child's awareness during the procedure was necessary for him to observe the immediate effects of the treatment. Or subject displayed typical resistance to cranial access procedure. Dr. Harrington wrote, but achieved proper stillness once restraints were properly applied. Drilling proceeded smoothly with subject maintaining consciousness throughout. Initial drainage of approximately 4 hours of fluid produced immediate improvement in subject's compliance and attention span. Marcus survived this initial surgery, but was subjected to additional procedures over the following months as Dr. Harrington refined his technique and tested different approaches to what he called cranial pressure relief. The boy's behavioral changes, documented in daily observation logs, show the progressive brain damage caused by Dr. Harrington's repeated surgeries, loss of speech, difficulty with basic motor functions, and eventual complete loss of personality and cognitive function. But Marcus's case was not unique. Dr. Harrington's medical logs document similar surgical experiments conducted on dozens of children over the years, each procedure designed to test a different theory about the biological basis of behavioral problems. Children diagnosed with excessive emotional expression were subjected to surgical removal of tear ducts and modifications to facial muscles that prevented them from displaying emotion. Those labeled as hyperactive underwent procedures designed to damage the parts of their brains responsible for movement and energy. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Harrington's medical program was his development of what he called pharmaceutical conditioning, the use of experimental drugs to modify children's behavior and personality. His laboratory contained hundreds of bottles filled with chemical compounds that he had either synthesized himself or obtained through correspondence with other researchers conducting similar experiments at institutions across the country. The pharmaceutical logs describe systematic drug testing conducted on children as young as 6 years old. Dr. Harrington would administer various compounds and carefully observe their effects, documenting changes in behavior, physical symptoms, and psychological state. Children were given drugs that induced paralysis to test theories about the relationship between physical movement and moral development. Others received compounds that caused hallucinations, which Dr. Harrington believed might allow him to directly access and modify their thoughts. One of his most extensively documented pharmaceutical experiments involved a group of 12 children who were given daily doses of a compound that Dr. Harrington called moral clarification serum, a mixture of opium derivatives, mercury, and plant extracts that he believed would eliminate their capacity for deception and criminal thinking. The children in this experiment were monitored continuously for 6 months as the compound gradually destroyed their nervous systems, causing progressive paralysis, loss of cognitive function, and eventual death. Dr. Harrington's notes on this experiment show no recognition of the children as human beings deserving of compassion or care. Subjects in the moral clarification study have demonstrated conclusively that criminal tendencies can be eliminated through pharmaceutical intervention. He wrote, while the current compound requires refinement to reduce mortality rates, the fundamental principle has been validated. Future research should focus on developing more precise dosages that achieve behavioral modification without terminal side effects. The most chilling aspect of these pharmaceutical experiments was Dr. Harrington's detailed documentation of the children's suffering. His logs include minute descriptions of seizures, screaming fits, and physical convulsions caused by his experimental drugs, all recorded with clinical detachment, as if he were observing laboratory animals rather than children in agony. He noted which compounds caused the most dramatic behavioral changes, which induced the most complete compliance, and which eliminated specific personality traits that he considered undesirable. Throughout this period, Dr. Harrington maintained extensive correspondence with other researchers conducting similar experiments at institutions across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. Letters found in his laboratory reveal a network of doctors, psychiatrists, and institutional administrators who shared information about techniques for behavioral modification, pharmaceutical experimentation, and surgical intervention in children's brains and nervous systems. One particularly disturbing letter, dated March 1883 and signed by someone identified as Dr. Wilhelm K. at an institution in Pennsylvania, describes experiments with a procedure called moral lobotomy, designed to eliminate criminal tendencies by severing specific brain connections. Your success with cranial pressure relief is most encouraging, Dr. K wrote. Our own experiments with selective brain tissue removal have produced remarkable improvements in subject compliance, though we have observed that complete personality elimination occasionally occurs. We have found that subjects who undergo total personality removal require minimal supervision and can perform simple labor tasks displaying any criminal or antisocial behaviors. This corresponded that Whispering Pines was not an isolated case of medical abuse, but part of a systematic network of institutions where vulnerable children were being used experimentally. So social aim of experimental use of experimental subject syndrome were able to also say social improvement. The letters described the sharing of techniques, the coordination of experiments, and the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for breaking children's spirits and reshaping their personalities, according to adult theories about proper behavior and moral development. The true scope of Dr. Harrington's experimental network became clear through the investigation that followed the 1889 fire at Whispering Pines. When Marcus Wheeler, the journalist from the Burlington Free Press, began examining the recovered documents, he discovered that the orphanage had been operating as a research facility for what amounted to a secret society of physicians and institutional administrators who believed that children's minds and bodies could be modified through scientific intervention. Wheeler's investigation revealed that Dr. Harrington had been receiving funding for his experiments from sources far beyond the charitable donations that supposedly supported the orphanage. Financial records recovered from the fireproof safe showed regular payments from medical schools, pharmaceutical companies, and wealthy individuals who were interested in supporting research into what they called criminal anthropology and hereditary vice elimination. The payments came with specific requirements for research outcomes. A contract dated 1879 with the Boston Medical Research Foundation required Dr. Harrington to produce demonstrable evidence of behavioral modification in juvenile subjects with hereditary criminal tendencies. The contract specified that successful modification would be measured by complete elimination of antisocial behaviors, achievement of perfect compliance with institutional authority, and development of productive labor capacity without requirements for external motivation or supervision. To meet these contractual obligations, Dr. Harrington had developed an increasingly systematic approach to his experimental program. Children admitted to Whispering Pines were evaluated using a complex scoring system that rated their reformation potential, based on factors including family history, physical characteristics, and behavioral assessments. Those with the lowest scores were designated as experimental candidates and subjected to the most intensive interventions. Wheeler's investigation uncovered evidence that Dr. Harrington had been falsifying his reports to funding sources, claiming success rates for his experimental treatments that bore no relationship to the actual outcomes, while his research logs documented the deaths, permanent disabilities, and psychological destruction caused by his experiments. His official reports described these same procedures as successful behavioral modifications that had transformed dangerous juvenile criminals into productive and compliant citizens. The most disturbing aspect of this deception was Dr. Harrington's practice of displaying successfully treated children to visitors and inspectors as evidence of his method's effectiveness. These children, who had survived his experimental procedures but had been left with severe brain damage, physical disabilities, or complete personality destruction, were presented as examples of successful rehabilitation. Their compliance and lack of disruptive behavior were cited as proof that criminal tendencies had been eliminated through scientific intervention. Thomas Kellerman, who had survived Dr. Harrington's psychological conditioning, but had been left unable to speak or care for himself independently, was frequently displayed to visitors as a reformed theft case. Sarah Dunham, who had survived the loyalty transfer conditioning, but had lost all capacity for emotional expression or human connection, was presented as an example of successful treatment for unhealthy emotional dependency. These children's obvious disabilities were explained as temporary side effects of the reformation process that would resolve as their moral development progressed. But Wheeler's investigation also uncovered evidence of children who had genuinely disappeared from Whispering Pines, not through escape or adoption, but through experimental procedures that had resulted in death. Dr. Harrington's practice was to report these deaths to state authorities as resulting from natural causes, typically listing illnesses such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, or heart failure that could not be easily challenged by officials who never examined the bodies. The actual cause of death in these cases was typically the direct result of Dr. Harrington's experimental procedures. Children died from brain damage caused by his cranial surgeries, from organ failure caused by his pharmaceutical experiments, or from infections resulting from his surgical modifications. In some cases, children died simply from the combination of malnutrition, exposure, and psychological trauma that was inherent in his treatment methods. Harrington's logs reveal that he viewed these deaths not as failures of his methods, but as necessary casualties in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. Subject number 47 expired during the third cranial pressure relief procedure. He wrote in one typical entry, but the preliminary results obtained during the first two procedures provide valuable data for refining the technique. Future subjects should undergo more extensive preparation to improve survival rates while maintaining the beneficial effects on behavioral compliance. Perhaps the most chilling discovery in Wheeler's investigation was evidence that Dr. Harrington had been selling some of the children from his experimental program to other researchers at institutions across the country. Financial records showed payments received for subject transfers to facilities in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York, where the children would undergo additional experimental procedures as part of coordinated research programs. These transfers were arranged through a network that Dr. Harrington called the Scientific Advancement Society, a group of physicians and researchers who shared subjects, techniques, and funding in pursuit of what they believed was groundbreaking research into human behavior modification. The society operated through coded correspondence and had established protocols for transferring subjects between institutions without alerting state authorities or leaving official records that could be traced. Children selected for transfer were told they were being moved to new facilities where they would receive better treatment or have opportunities for adoption. In reality, they were being transported to other experimental sites where they would undergo procedures that were considered too dangerous or controversial even for Dr. Harrington standards. The transfer documents described children being sent for advanced cranial modification, intensive pharmaceutical conditioning, and comprehensive behavioral restructuring procedures that had mortality rates approaching 100%. The network of institutions conducting these experiments on children reveals a systematic conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of medical and academic establishments in 19th century America. If this evidence of organized child abuse disguised as scientific research is shocking you, share this video with others who need to know about these buried truths. Hit that like button to help us continue exposing the dark secrets that powerful institutions tried to hide. And don't forget to subscribe for more investigations into America's forgotten victims. But the most horrifying revelation was yet to come, evidence that showed exactly how Dr. Harrington's experimental program had finally come to an end and why the authorities had been so determined to suppress all information about what had really happened at Whispering Pines. The end of Dr. Harrington's 18th-year reign of terror at Whispering Pines came not through intervention by authorities or exposure by whistleblowers, but through an event that revealed the true scope of his crimes in the most dramatic way possible. Wheeler's investigation uncovered evidence that the fire, which destroyed the orphanage in 1889, was not accidental but was deliberately set by the children themselves in a desperate attempt to escape their tormentors and expose the horrors they had endured. The arson plot was organized by a group of older children who had survived Dr. Harrington's experimental program but retained enough cognitive function to understand their situation and plan a response. Led by Elizabeth Crane, a 16-year-old who had been at Whispering Pines for 8 years and had undergone multiple pharmaceutical experiments that had left her partially paralyzed but mentally alert, the group had spent months planning their escape and revenge. Elizabeth's survival was itself remarkable, as she had been subjected to some of Dr. Harrington's most intensive experimental procedures. Her case file, recovered from the basement laboratory, documented 3 years of pharmaceutical conditioning that had been designed to eliminate what Dr. Harrington called her leadership tendencies and rebellious disposition. The experiments had left her with permanent nerve damage that affected her ability to walk and use her hands. Yet, it failed to break her spirit or diminish her intelligence. Working with 5 other survivors of the experimental program, children left with various disabilities but enough mental function to participate in planning, Elizabeth developed a comprehensive scheme to destroy the orphanage and ensure that evidence of Dr. Harrington's crimes would be found by authorities. The plan involved setting multiple fires throughout the building, trapping Dr. Harrington and his wife in the basement laboratory, and positioning the bodies of children who had died during experiments in locations where firefighters and investigators would discover them. The children had spent months secretly gathering materials for their arson plot, stealing lamp oil, matches, and combustible materials from various parts of the orphanage and hiding them in unused basement areas. They also meticulously studied the building's layout to identify the most effective locations for setting fires that would spread rapidly while allowing themselves enough time to escape. However, the most crucial aspect of their plan involved exposing the evidence of Dr. Harrington's experimental program. Elizabeth and her conspirators gained access to the basement laboratory by stealing keys from Dr. Harrington's office. They then spent weeks systematically organizing the experimental logs, medical equipment, and preserved specimens to ensure they would survive the fire and be discovered by investigators. The most damning documents were moved to the fireproof safe, and the laboratory equipment was arranged to clearly demonstrate its purpose to anyone examining the ruins. The children also prepared detailed written testimonies describing their experiences under Dr. Harrington's experimental program. These testimonies, written in multiple copies and hidden in various locations throughout the orphanage, provided first-hand accounts of the psychological conditioning, medical experiments, and pharmaceutical testing conducted on dozens of children over the years. The testimonies included specific details about procedures, dates, and outcomes that could be corroborated with Dr. Harrington's own experimental logs. On the night of June 23, 1889, Elizabeth and her conspirators executed their plan. Using accumulated lamp oil and combustible materials, they set fires in the orphanage's kitchen, dining hall, and administrative offices. These areas were chosen to burn quickly and create sufficient smoke and chaos to prevent Dr. Harrington and his staff from organizing an effective response. The children's plan worked with devastating efficiency. Dr. Harrington and his wife, along with the 2 staff members who had assisted in the experimental program, were trapped in the basement as the fires spread more rapidly than anticipated. By the time volunteer firefighters arrived from Millbrook, the orphanage's upper floors were completely engulfed in flames, and smoke had filled the basement areas where Dr. Harrington's laboratory was located. Elizabeth and 4 of her conspirators successfully escaped the building and fled into the surrounding woods, where they had prepared supplies and hiding places in advance. Tragically, one child, Marcus Trenton, who had been subjected to Dr. Harrington's cranial surgeries, was too severely disabled to participate in the escape and died in the fire, along with several other children confined to the basement reflection chambers. The investigation that followed the fire uncovered exactly what Elizabeth and her conspirators had intended: overwhelming evidence of the systematic abuse and experimental torture that had been conducted at Whispering Pines for 18 years. The fireproof safe containing Dr. Harrington's experimental logs, provided documentation of hundreds of procedures performed on dozens of children. The basement laboratory, partially preserved despite the fire damage, contained medical equipment, preserved specimens, and pharmaceutical supplies that clearly demonstrated the scope of the experimental program. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation recovered the written testimonies that Elizabeth and her conspirators had prepared, offering detailed first-hand accounts of life under Dr. Harrington's experimental regime. These testimonies, corroborated by the physical evidence found in the laboratory, painted a picture of institutional abuse so systematic and horrific that state authorities immediately moved to suppress all information about the case. This was done to prevent public panic and to protect the reputation of Vermont's child welfare system. The testimonies written by Elizabeth Crane and her fellow survivors provided the most detailed account ever recorded of systematic child abuse in an American institution. Elizabeth's testament, written in a careful hand despite her partial paralysis, described 18 years of torture disguised as moral education and scientific research, revealing the full scope of Dr. Harrington's experimental program and its impact on the children who endured it. Dishat? Harrington believed that children like us were born defective, Elizabeth wrote, and that it was his Christian duty to either fix our defects or document our failure to be reformed for the benefit of science. He told us repeatedly that we were fortunate to serve a purpose greater than our worthless lives, and that our suffering was necessary to develop treatments that would prevent other children from being born with our moral and mental deficiencies. Elizabeth's testimony described the progression of Dr. Harrington's experimental program, beginning with psychological conditioning designed to break children's spirits and establish absolute compliance. New children were taken to the reflection chambers within days of their arrival, she wrote. They would emerge weeks or months later as different people, quiet, obedient, and terrified of displaying any emotion or personality that might attract Dr. Harrington's attention. Those who survived the reflection chambers learned that invisibility was the only safety and that any sign of independence or curiosity would result in selection for more intensive treatments. The medical experiments described in Elizabeth's testimony revealed the full horror of Dr. Harrington's belief that criminal behavior and moral deficiency could be eliminated through surgical and pharmaceutical intervention. Dr. Harrington performed surgeries on children's brains because he believed that criminal thoughts were caused by physical defects that could be corrected. Elizabeth wrote, he would drill holes in children's skulls while they were awake, claiming that their consciousness during the procedure was necessary for him to observe the immediate effects of his treatments. Many children died during these surgeries, and those who survived were left unable to speak, walk, or care for themselves. The pharmaceutical experiments were equally horrific. According to Elizabeth's testimony, Dr. Harrington tested hundreds of different drugs on us, always claiming that he was close to discovering a compound that would eliminate criminal tendencies permanently. She wrote, children were given drugs that caused seizures, paralysis, hallucinations, and death. Dr. Harrington would carefully observe our suffering and record detailed notes about which drugs produced which effects, treating our pain as valuable scientific data rather than recognizing us as human beings deserving of compassion. Elizabeth's testimony also revealed the psychological manipulation that Dr. Harrington used to maintain control over the children and prevent them from reporting his abuse to outside authorities. Dr. Harrington convinced us that we were inherently evil and that his treatments were the only hope we had for salvation, she wrote. He told us that normal people would never accept us because of our defects, and that anyone who discovered our criminal nature would have us executed or imprisoned for life. He made us believe that enduring his experiments was our only chance to become worthy of existence. The most devastating aspect of Elizabeth's testimony was her description of how Dr. Harrington's experimental program had affected the children's relationships with each other. Harrington deliberately destroyed our capacity to trust or care for each other because he believed that emotional attachments interfered with moral development, she wrote. Children who showed affection toward others were separated and subjected to conditioning designed to eliminate their emotional responses. He wanted us to be isolated, dependent only on him, and incapable of forming the human connections that might give us strength to resist his treatments. Elizabeth's fellow survivors provided additional testimonies that corroborated her account and filled in details about specifics of Dr. Harrington's program. James Fletcher, who had survived 3 years of pharmaceutical conditioning, described the gradual loss of personality that resulted from prolonged exposure to Dr. Harrington's experimental drugs. "I can remember being a different person before the treatments began," James wrote, "but those memories feel like they belong to someone else." Dr. Harrington's drugs didn't just change our behavior, they changed who we were inside, taking away parts of our personalities that we can never recover. Mary Sinclair, who had undergone Dr. Harrington's loyalty transfer conditioning similar to the Dunham twins, described the psychological techniques used to break emotional bonds between children. Dr. Harrington would force us to watch other children being punished and reward us for showing no emotional response. Mary wrote, "He taught us that caring about others was a weakness that prevented moral development, and that true reformation required complete emotional detachment. By the time he finished with us, we were incapable of feeling empathy or compassion for anyone, including ourselves." The testimonies also revealed the extent of Dr. Harrington's collaboration with other researchers at institutions across the country. Elizabeth described children being taken away for transfer to advanced research facilities and never returning. Dr. Harrington would select children who had survived his preliminary treatments and send them to other doctors who conducted experiments that were too dangerous even for Whispering Pines. She wrote, "We knew that children selected for transfer would never come back, but we also knew that refusing to go would result in punishments worse than whatever awaited us at the other facilities." Perhaps most significantly, the testimonies revealed that Dr. Harrington's experimental program had been conducted with the knowledge and approval of state authorities, who were supposed to oversee the orphanage's operations. Elizabeth described regular visits from officials who toured the facility, but never saw the basement laboratories or spoke with children who were undergoing experimental treatments. Dr. Harrington had arrangements with the inspection officials, she wrote. They would arrive at scheduled times and tour only the parts of the orphanage where the reformed children were kept. Those of us undergoing experimental treatments were hidden in the basement during inspection visits, and the officials never asked to see us or questioned why so many children seemed to have no personality or emotional responses. The financial records recovered from the orphanage confirmed Elizabeth's claims about official complicity in Dr. Harrington's experimental program. Regular payments from state agencies, medical institutions, and private foundations had funded the research, with contracts that specified requirements for behavioral modification outcomes and documentation of reformation techniques. These contracts demonstrated that Dr. Harrington's abuse of children was not the work of a single deranged individual, but part of a systematic program supported by respected institutions and government agencies. The exposure of Dr. Harrington's experimental program at Whispering Pines triggered a scandal that reached far beyond Vermont's borders, ultimately leading to congressional hearings on the regulation of child welfare institutions and the ethics of medical research involving minors. The evidence recovered from the orphanage fire provided documentation of systematic abuse that had been supported by prominent medical schools, government agencies, and charitable foundations, revealing a network of complicity that extended throughout the American establishment. Marcus Wheeler's articles about Whispering Pines, published in a series of exposes during the fall of 1889, created a national outcry that forced authorities to acknowledge the scope of institutional child abuse that had been hidden behind the facade of scientific progress and Christian charity. Wheeler's investigation, supported by the detailed testimonies from Elizabeth Crane and her fellow survivors, provided irrefutable evidence that hundreds of children had been subjected to torture, medical experimentation, and psychological conditioning at institutions across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. The immediate aftermath of Wheeler's exposes saw the closure of 14 institutions that had been part of Dr. Harrington's research network. Federal investigators, armed with evidence recovered from Whispering Pines, conducted raids on orphanages, reform schools, and private hospitals in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, and Maine, uncovering similar experimental programs at each facility. The raids resulted in the arrest of 23 individuals involved in unauthorized medical experimentation on children, though most received only brief prison sentences due to their connections with prominent academic and medical institutions. Elizabeth Crane, despite her physical disabilities caused by Dr. Harrington's pharmaceutical experiments, became a powerful advocate for institutional reform and children's rights. Her testimony before a congressional committee investigating child welfare practices provided lawmakers with detailed evidence of systematic abuse that had been conducted with government funding and official approval. Elizabeth's advocacy, supported by other Whispering Pines survivors, led to the passage of federal legislation requiring external oversight of all institutions housing children and establishing legal protections for minors involved in medical research. The investigation also revealed the financial scope of the experimental network. Records seized from the various institutions showed that Dr. Harrington and his collaborators had received over $200 million in funding from sources including the U.S. Army Medical Department, several prominent universities, and wealthy philanthropists who believed they were supporting cutting-edge research into criminal behavior and moral development. The disclosure of this funding led to congressional hearings that exposed the complicity of respected institutions in systematic child abuse. Perhaps most significantly, the Whispering Pines scandal led to the establishment of legal precedents that continue to protect children in institutional care today. The testimonies provided by Elizabeth and her fellow survivors were used to develop federal standards for the treatment of minors in institutional settings, including requirements for external oversight, limitations on medical procedures, and protections for children's rights to refuse experimental treatments. The surviving children from Whispering Pines faced years of recovery from the physical and psychological damage inflicted by Dr. Harrington's experimental program. Elizabeth Crane, despite her partial paralysis, completed her education and became a nurse, dedicating her life to caring for children who had suffered institutional abuse. James Fletcher, who had survived the pharmaceutical conditioning, became an advocate for victims of medical experimentation and worked to establish legal protections for research subjects. Mary Sinclair, who had endured the loyalty transfer conditioning, spent years learning to form human relationships again and eventually established a support network for survivors of institutional abuse. The physical site of Whispering Pines was never rebuilt. The orphanage's ruins remained visible for decades, serving as a grim reminder of the horrors conducted there. Local residents reported that the basement areas, partially preserved despite the fire damage, continued to contain evidence of Dr. Harrington's experimental program well into the 20th century. The site was eventually cleared and converted into a memorial park dedicated to the children who had suffered and died at the orphanage. The memorial, established in 1925 through funds raised by Elizabeth Crane and other survivors, bears the names of over 200 children who died at Whispering Pines during Dr. Harrington's 18th-year reign of terror. The memorial's inscription, written by Elizabeth herself, reads, "In memory of the children who suffered at this place and in honor of those who survived to tell their story. May their voices ensure that such horrors are never again inflicted on the innocent in the name of science, charity, or moral improvement." The long-term impact of the Whispering Pines scandal extended far beyond immediate reforms to child welfare institutions. The case became a landmark in the development of medical ethics, establishing principles for informed consent, protection of vulnerable populations, and oversight of experimental research that continue to guide medical practice today. The testimonies provided by Elizabeth and her fellow survivors were studied by psychologists and social workers, contributing to the development of trauma-informed care and therapeutic approaches for helping children recover from institutional abuse. Wheeler's investigation also revealed the extent to which respected institutions had been willing to overlook evidence of child abuse when it served their research interests. The correspondence between Dr. Harrington and his network of collaborators showed that reports of children's deaths, disabilities, and psychological damage had been routinely dismissed as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. This revelation led to the establishment of ethics review boards at universities and medical institutions designed to prevent future exploitation of vulnerable populations in the name of research. The financial institutions and philanthropic organizations that had funded Dr. Harrington's experimental program faced public scrutiny and legal action that continued for years after the initial scandal. Several prominent families who had donated to Whispering Pines were forced to establish victim compensation funds when their correspondence with Dr. Harrington revealed knowledge of the experimental program's true nature. The Boston Medical Research Foundation, which had provided substantial funding for the experiments, was disbanded after congressional investigations revealed that its leadership had received detailed reports about child deaths and disabilities, but had continued funding the research. The Whispering Pines case also had international implications, as Wheeler's investigation revealed that Dr. Harrington's research had been shared with medical institutions in Europe and other countries where similar experimental programs were being conducted on vulnerable populations. The scandal contributed to the development of international protocols for medical research and the protection of human subjects, establishing principles that were later incorporated into the Nuremberg Code and other international agreements governing medical experimentation. Today, the Whispering Pines case is studied in medical schools, social work programs, and ethics courses as an example of how scientific authority can be used to justify systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. Elizabeth Crane's testimony, preserved in congressional records and academic archives, continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of protecting children's rights and maintaining ethical standards in medical research. The children who died at Whispering Pines, including Marcus Trenton, Sarah and Rebecca Dunham, and dozens of others whose names were recorded in Dr. Harrington's experimental logs, are remembered not only as victims of institutional abuse, but as witnesses whose suffering contributed to fundamental changes in how society protects its most vulnerable members. Their stories, preserved through Elizabeth's advocacy and Wheeler's journalism, ensure that the horrors of Whispering Pines serve as a permanent warning against the dangers of unchecked authority and the need for constant vigilance in protecting children's rights and welfare. The tragedy of Whispering Pines reveals how easily institutions designed to protect children can become instruments of systematic abuse when authority goes unchecked and vulnerable populations are viewed as expendable in pursuit of larger goals. Elizabeth Crane's courage in exposing these horrors, despite the physical and psychological damage she had endured, demonstrates the power of survivors to create change and protect future generations from similar abuse. Her story reminds us that the price of protecting children's rights is constant vigilance against those who would exploit the vulnerable in the name of science, charity, or moral improvement. What do you think of this story? How do we ensure that the lessons learned from Whispering Pines continue to protect children today? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts with our community. If you found this investigation into America's hidden history of institutional abuse important and disturbing, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with others who need to understand these buried truths. See you in the next video where we'll continue uncovering the dark secrets that powerful institutions tried to hide from history.